It's great to see you again.
Good to see you, James.
And we're here in the offices of Kosmos Journal, and we've been invited to have a conversation about the commons.
There's so much to be said.
There's a lot to be said. Where do we begin?
The Reagan-Thatcher era, you could say it's a convenient marking point of when things radically shifted and market exploitation, commodification, private property rights went into overdrive, so to speak. And we started to see the patenting of genetic knowledge and information, of bacteria. You started to see gross expansions of copyright and trademark law. You started to see the whole philosophy of neoliberalism starting to take root and consolidate and become the new norm, so to speak, eclipsing a lot of democratic norms, eclipsing a lot of civil society interests. So I like to, that's sort of a major shift, I think, in modern times, about 30 years ago.
Yeah. So we're talking about privatizations, liberalization of trade, and a number of other phenomena that continue to widen the gap between in society between the rich and poor.
Deregulation, the delegitimation of government and the regulatory state for helping to solve problems. And I think that has sort of left us defenseless against some of these enclosures. So I think that's partly the plight, but maybe you should talk a little bit about the financialization of those financially driven enclosures and how powerful they are.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I've noticed too is that young people today don't necessarily know that these enclosures are going on because they don't necessarily understand the history of it because they've grown up in an era of privatizations and they take it for granted that these things are happening. But as you say, part of the deregulatory atmosphere and the liberalization of trade has been pushed by the banking system. And so there has been a new financialization of assets in the world, which are increasingly encompassing the commons, including patents, intellectual property, and now the privatization of national parks is being discussed and other government entities that could be up for sale, with the idea that the private sector could manage these properties much better than the state could manage them. So why not do it? Because it would unlock this new source of value for the world.
Well, I think that it's also seen that resources that are owned by the public or managed by the government are free for the taking or at a discount. They're a cheap resource, so to speak, because they're not, nobody's speaking for them, or at least they're not well protected. And so this is a path of least resistance for capital to expand itself. And I think you've spoken about the securitization of the commons, how it's being used as in new financial instruments as collateral, or the revenue flows from natural resources becoming a financial interest. And this is sort of a new frontier.
I don't know how to give a date to this, but certainly it has its origins in the Milton Friedman ideas of the 70s and 80s. But it's escalated, and it has a lot to do with what happened in the international economy, moving from fixed exchange rates to floating exchange rates. We've lost our mooring. There's no stability in the monetary system because the problem has been that the central banks have a mandate to print as much money as they want, which creates over-leveraging because they're lending out so much money. As a result of printing it, they're lending it out, creating more debt. Collateralizing that debt is very difficult because it means more enclosures. It means expanding the asset class of the things that could be considered reserve assets on the balance sheets of the banks. So we're in a real pickle right now, I think, because since 2008, the power structure decided that the public would once again bail out the banks in that financial crisis that we had. But I think that won't happen again because I don't think the taxpayers around the world are willing to pony up another $17 or $18 billion to prevent the too big to fail banks from falling under. Meanwhile, those same banks, in some cases, have doubled and quadrupled their portfolios in the last 6 years since 2008. So what's really happened here? This leads into what I'm seeing happening today. Is that there's a new series of privatizations that are being proposed now, which take us into a new level of this enclosures that we've been watching as a historical phenomenon for a long time.
And a lot of this remains invisible, not talked about, partly because we don't have a vocabulary for talking about it. And I think that's really where the Commons comes in as a useful way to sort of intervene in the standard language by respectable policymakers and economists and so forth who simply don't want to grapple with this. But the Commons gives us a vocabulary for talking about the shared wealth that perhaps is not or should not be marketized, financialized, yet is nonetheless indispensable to human life and our ecosystems. How can we show that the language of the Commons describes innumerable phenomena in the world, from lots of digital commons, from free and open source software and Wikipedia and open access journals and social networking, to lots of indigenous natural resource commons, traditional commons. You know, an estimated 2 billion people in the world depend upon natural resource commons for their everyday livelihoods: forests, fisheries, irrigation water, and wild game. And these are commons, yet many of the standard economics textbooks make no mention of the commons beyond the tragedy. So I think part of the challenge is developing this shared language to describe these phenomena, some of which are already happening, some of which the language will give license to embark upon new commons. But I see that as a major challenge we face.
And the bridge for me has always been that the commons have pre-existed. They've been here since the beginning of time. It's the market and the state that have emerged in the meantime, crowded out all our cognitive thinking around what was pre-existent. So it takes us, the challenge for us is a big mind stretch to get back to the pre-existent realities. And we say, well, what are the commons? I don't understand what that is. It's right in front of your face.
Which is why this is really not so much a matter of politics or policy per se. It's in our minds, it's in our language, it's in our culture. And it's trying to sort of understand that it's at that deep level of reconfiguring our mental software almost, as well as our psychic connections to explain it. It cuts very deeply if you take the commons seriously. It's not just something that policymakers should grapple with.
In a way, it's the story that we tell about ourselves and the story of how we define human nature. But it's also the fact that we don't have a consistent plan for being able to roll out that story into meaningful policy that makes coherence between what you could say the self and the other and the created environment.
I think that's really well put, because we are so enthralled to Homo economicus, the individual, rational, utility maximizing person who is the fable of economics, is an erroneous notion of what human beings are, because evolutionary scientists will tell us that we are social creatures and that our very identity comes from being in a community, and that commons have been with us from the beginning of the human species. So can we acknowledge these realities in how we approach governance and production, and start to find a language to acknowledge this, rather than pretend that neoliberal norms about individualism and being so atomized are true, because they're not.
I often think about laissez-faire capitalism referring to rational expectations and human reason. It's all based on reasonable approaches. Is it reasonable to import food from halfway around the world? I mean, seriously, is economics really about reason, or is it about the emotional well-being that economics can provide to society? Isn't that really what's going on with economics?
I mean, it gets as deep as acknowledging that subjectivity and intersubjectivity, our feelings and our emotions, are germane to this discussion, because there is no imaginary Archimedean point way out here from which we can presume to be distanced from all of this. There is no objectivity without we're immersed in reality, and we have these relationships that are emotional and subjective. And so in some ways it goes as deep as trying to validate those inclinations, spiritual, emotional, psychic, subjective, as important to this discussion of how human beings save themselves and the world.
I imagine that some people would find this conversation a little too warm and fuzzy for their taste, but the fact is that there are lots of examples now of commons that don't necessarily see it from this idea of emotional well-being, although ultimately that is what they're expressing. I mean, we could begin to list some of the kinds of successful examples of commons across the world. I mean, you've done extensive studies on digital commons and the kinds of areas that you've worked with Burns Weston in terms of looking at the green commons. And so can you talk about the range of different successful examples of working commons?
Well, I think that Elinor Ostrom was, of course, the pioneer in doing a lot of field work in demonstrating that small-scale natural resource commons are entirely viable. And you see them in Nepalese communities managing forests, or Indian communities managing water resources. You see them in lots of indigenous cultures. The potato park in Peru, which manages genetically diverse potato varieties. You see them everywhere, but as I say, the phenomena hasn't been validated intellectually or in policy so much. And I would just add that all of this is about self-organized cooperation. And it's not as if it's people don't have disagreements or it's one big happy caring and sharing, but it is a framework for developing sustainable consensus, which is not exploitative and grossly unequal. So it is a paradigm for holistically and over the long term managing things, getting out of the strict private property notions into notions of stewardship, which implicitly means long-term and community, as opposed to individualistic and self-serving.
Self-organization for me is about, right at the heart of what we're really talking about here, because the traditional argument has been that people are too ill-equipped and too ignorant to manage their own resources, and that's what the commons movement has shown, that it's not true. But at the same time, it's just not that it's an alternative, it's actually an evolutionary process, because nature self-organizes. Nature is not as chaotic as some people suspected that it is. There are major principles of self-organization that really guide biology, for example. And it seems to me that economy is moving, it needs to move closer and closer to biological models. And so we're looking at bioregions now. We're looking at the self-sufficiency of bioregions as an alternative to the structures that the sovereign states have created, because many times the bioregions cut across those sovereign borders. So I like to think that what's happening right now is that natural boundaries are becoming more important than political boundaries in many ways.
Well, I find this fascinating because in all these different ways we're starting to understand that some of our traditional lenses for viewing the world are just inaccurate. That we look at them in static ways, we look at them as objects, when in fact we should be thinking about flows of things, we should be thinking about relationships, we should think about dynamic, how changing they are, and how they're nested within different spheres. So it's a very different way of conceptualizing how the world generates wealth. And as you said, human communities are naturally generative. It's not as if they need a market or a state to tell them to do something. And so part of this is about recognizing what is really quite natural and giving it the room to evolve and grow.
It seems that local communities and regional communities should become self-sufficient to the extent that they can before going out and trading with the rest of the world. Now that turns the Ricardian paradigm of international trade and comparative advantage completely backwards. But it seems to me that's the direction that we need to go during the 21st century. Otherwise, we're going to be creating resource wars between the various states of the world over the resources that they actually share in common but squabble over because of where the sovereign boundaries cut the bioregions in half.
And the reason that that inversion that you talk about, I think, is so important is because it creates a basic unit of stability that's ecologically sustainable that can be built upon, as opposed to creating units that are simply colonies from which one is always extracting resources for the larger market economy. So in other words, it can become a different foundational building block for an ecologically stable economy.
You know, and I don't think this obviates the role of business and government. I think they certainly have to be changed. But I don't see this as a direct threat to business and government. What I see is an evolving model where the commons becomes, I wouldn't necessarily say an equal player, but I would say part of the same kind of dynamic in the mix with the market and government.
I agree. There's two important points. The commons is not incompatible with the state and market and businesses, but I think a lot of the standard ways in which the state and business now operate will obviously have to change and come to respect the particular value that the commons brings to the table in achieving things that neither the market or state can achieve. The state as a very highly centralized, bureaucratic, rule-driven enterprise that may not have local knowledge, and markets as being so primarily focused on monetization and private property rights that it can't understand the value created through collective relationships. So finding a new equilibrium between market, state, and commons is a key thing to develop. But the other point is, you're right, we need to imagine new macro institutions and infrastructures that can facilitate the commons at the small scale.
Right.
Because some of these small commons need, first of all, protection and support from the larger framework, but second of all, that framework is important for its growth. One could not imagine, just to take a metaphor, the internet functioning without this superstructure of infrastructure to allow people to come together. And I think that we don't yet have that governance infrastructure at the macro level to support commons, and we need to explore that.
Yeah, well, if you look at the history of international regulation and multilateralism, it's not that old. I think that this needs to be put on a new footing, and I believe that bioregionalism will really inform this new kind of multilateralism. And at the same time, the people at the local levels, I know even in the commons movement, they look at the international institutions and they vilify them. And there's great reason to vilify the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO and the international banks. There's no question about that. But in vilifying them, the local people set up their own definition of self-sufficiency as being, we are going to hunker down in our self-sufficient environment. We're going to ignore all those international institutions that are creating the mayhem for us because it's our only way of surviving and it's our only way of creating our own identity, et cetera, and our own source of wealth, indigenous wealth. But at the same time, what I see happening is setting up a new kind of adversity between the local and the global, which is not healthy for the local people in developing the self-sufficiency, because the fact is that we do need strong international institutions. I don't know, strong is the word, but we need international institutions, but ones that are more amenable to the commons and actually are supporting what's happening on the ground rather than ripping it off. But it doesn't mean that at the local level we should be becoming anti-globalization or anti-globalism, let's say. But the fact is to begin to create an international architecture and begin to envision that in a way that would be truly supportive of self-sufficient regional economies, local economies in moving forward the prospects of the commons?
I think that part of the problem is that the commons movement has to mature and develop more to support, to develop an international vision. And perhaps we should just talk for a moment about what the commons movement consists of these days. And I think it's more of a proto-movement that is still coalescing and trying to find coherence, but it consists of a highly eclectic variety of different commoners, yet they do share many fundamental values. So you have, we mentioned the digital commons, which itself is highly diverse, but we have a lot of these natural resource commons, whether from traditional communities or indigenous, but we have the right to the city movement, people claiming urban spaces. We have a lot of land conservation movements. We have a lot of social commons and even such things as couch surfing, as personal travel, hospitality are new types of commons. Well, a lot of these different movements have not found each other, started to develop a shared language, let alone developing the policy proposals or institutional proposals for facilitating the commons sector, as I like to call it. So I think we are kind of in a gap right now in trying to move to that new space, the new direction.
Yeah, the gap is somewhat troubling for me personally, because I see the private sector moving way out, staying several steps ahead of where some of the discourse is going around the commons. In fact, learning from the discourse around the commons to begin to say, well, we are really talking about commons eventually, but let's collateralize the commons to work back into the marketplace, which is why for one reason, I don't think this concept of green economics per se really works, because we're going for the environmental by saying we're going to raise prices, which means we're actually marketizing the cost of goods and services, and the fact is that we're reverting back to the market system anyway through this process of trying to establish a green economy. And
I'll mention the analog for that is the so-called sharing economy in digital spaces, where you have a lot of Silicon Valley tech people saying, isn't this great? You can have phone apps for taxi services. You can rent out your extra room, and you can marketize so many aspects of things. Well, in some ways, this is creating greater precariousness, where everybody is a freelancer who earns this much.
Yeah.
And in some ways, a lot of it is not driving sharing, except so much as capital can get a lot of free work at a discount. Mm-hmm. So there's a real challenge in protecting the commons as opposed to simply marketizing it and calling it sharing or calling it green.
I know. I saw, am I right about this? Car sharing, Zipcar, Avis bought out Zipcar. I think that happened recently, didn't it? Things like that are happening a lot. So they're rediscovering the commons, but they're turning it around and saying, we're doing the right thing, but again, it's privatization, and it's more enclosures of the commons.
So a part of a challenge is to really maintain the integrity of commons, as opposed to simply being a helpmate for capital to do its things more efficiently with less overhead costs.
People, profit, planet always reverts back to the market system, and that's the biggest problem I have with green economics. I don't think that's the way it's going to work. I mean, it's good to be aware of all the variables, people, profit, planet, but again, it doesn't encompass the commons effectively, and that is really the challenge right now, and partly to educate the people in the environmental movement that maybe they're going down a course by following, the idea that just raise the prices of goods and then you're going to, be able to green the planet, to a more commons-based perspective.
But you provoke in me the real challenge, which is even many well-meaning environmentalists can't quite go there, because to assert some of these things is to immediately marginalize yourself politically, or to be on the fringe or a pariah. Mm-hmm. And so there's a real challenge of how do you assert these radically different terms for understanding the world and value in a political culture that immediately shunts you to the side. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, a serious challenge. How do we incubate these different ways of seeing, give them validity, recognition, help them grow? I don't have the answer, but I think that's what we need to be able to do somehow.
I think it's partly perception. I think it's identity. I think it's organizing ourselves around this in terms of self-organization of communities with the aim of self-reliance. And that's a start, I think, but it's a big challenge.
I think a lot of it is going to come from outside the existing framework by newcomers or the unorganized people who, the Occupy world did not work through lobbying Congress. They created a different center of gravity, and the world came to them. Just as Linux in its time was more effective in fighting Microsoft than the Justice Department antitrust lawsuit. It created a different center of gravity over here. Just as the local food movement has sort of not lobbied the USDA, and so I think it's creating these different centers of gravity outside the established matrix of power and policy. And once that can reach a certain scale or size or credibility, the rest of the world can't ignore it, and indeed it can become a magnet for alternative energies. That's my sort of pet theory for how it might happen.
Pluralism and diversity, I think, is a very important part of this. Polycentrism, as it's sometimes been called. Isn't there a problem with diversity in that if everybody's being very diverse, then what's the social cohesion that brings them all together within that diversity? Or in other words, what kind of self-organization do all the diverse communities within a region, are they able to create that new kind of unity within the diversity?
Well, that's, I think, an important question. I think I don't have a strict answer, but I have some suspicions. One, that the commons world, by not being into maximum acquisition, in other words, they have an ethic of sufficiency, has less of an imperative to colonize, take over, appropriate of others, and can play nicely with each other. And if you want to take an analogy, the whole digital world has lots of commons communities that are mutually supportive. The Creative Commons licensing world, the free software world, the Wikipedia world, the open access publishing world. These people are distinct commons worlds, but they collaborate with each other. I could imagine versions of that playing out where commoners saying, well, you have knowledge or resources that I have, and we can find a way to share them without being in a competitive bind of maximum acquisition. But this is a speculative territory for the future.
I think that this is the time when commons movement really has to step up. And it's been doing wonderful work, but I really think that it needs to continue to build up. And the challenges now are so great. And the commons movement, in my estimation, is the only meaningful alternative that's out there.
Yeah, I think there's really an important role for simply more relationship building conversations to broaden our own sense of possibility and imagination, and to develop working relationships with people, because that is the basis of so much of this, and there are preciously few opportunities for that to occur. There's a handful of websites and magazines, and I'm pleased that Kosmos is such a cross-fertilizer in that regard, but we need far more going on in that direction.
The role of education is really critical, and I see that as the first point that the commons movement really has to take under consideration in terms of the future, really expanding the avenues for introducing these ideas to a wider public. And then I think social action is a significant thing that can follow from that. But I think that the challenge is enormous right now, and I would really strongly urge anyone who's in the commons movement to begin to build these alliances to really create a greater sense of unity and social cohesion.
I might add that the commons is really, at a time of great political alienation and impasse, dysfunction, the commons provides something you can do right now without the permission of Washington or anybody else. There are things that can be done that are consequential. You know, the transition movement is sort of built on that premise of how do we deal with climate change and peak oil? We're going to deal with it in our communities right now ourselves. Yeah. And I think that's the great wholesome appeal of the Commons. We can do stuff, let's do it. And that can become catalytic over time if you get enough people to engage upon those Commons projects.
That's our ace in the hole. David, thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to you again.
It's great to talk with you again.
Thank you.